Well, we're going to continue with our series on judgment. Is it ever right to judge anyone wrong? And I have to tell you that as we got into this series, I have faced a fair bit of judgment myself over the title of the series. It would appear that there are two ways to spell the word judgment. And I started off with what, to me, is the right way to spell it, which puts an E in between the G and the M. However, it was pointed out to me, complete with web references and other strident arguments, that in current usage there is no E in the middle there. Thank you, Jenny Forberg. And actually the rest of the office rose up and called her blessed and said that I was wrong. So I gave in, and I went with what is supposedly the correct modern usage for the word judgment. And last Sunday, I displayed this for all to see, and immediately after the service, I was met at the door by Stephen and Sandra Woof, who are from Britain, and said, "We need to talk about spelling." So it doesn't matter really which way I spell this thing, it's going to come out wrong, okay? So you just see whatever it is you want to see, and leave me alone. So quick review. Judgment, the good, the bad, and the godly. Last week we talked about good judgment. Because there is this tension when we talk about judging. We know that Jesus said, don't judge, so you won't be judged. And yet we also know that we need to use discretion and exercise good judgment. And so how do we reconcile those two things together? What does good judgment look like? And the phrase that I gave you last week that at least has helped me to give some substance to this is that we are to judge the path and not the person. Judging the path means that I'm constantly engaged in a practice of looking to say what is good and right and beautiful and Christ-honoring. And that means I choose some things and I choose against some other things. And so the path, I am constantly exercising judgment to know where I am going and that I'm going in the right way. But that's a different thing than judging the person, where I try to assign worth to an individual. And I suggested to you last week that we judge our path on at least 4 different planes. The first being the physical, just the reality of the world. Right? It's the reason you put a seatbelt on when you start driving your car, because that's good judgment, because you know what happens if your car has an accident. And then we talked about we judge things aesthetically. We judge things that we deem to be beautiful or ugly, or that taste good or taste bad. And that artistic sense of it, which is much more subjective. It's influenced by culture, it's influenced by personal preference. And then there is the moral. What is right? What is wrong? And we talked about the fact that in order to have a sense of what is morally right, we have to ascribe to something higher than just ourselves. That there has to be some kind of standard that we decide what is right. Because what is morally right oftentimes isn't apparent in the immediate here and now. What's right in front of me and looks like it might be the most beneficial to me, oftentimes in the big picture, the long term, is in fact the wrong choice. And so what is the standard that I use to decide what is morally good? And then I suggested there was one more level that is unique for those who are followers of Jesus Christ. And that is, what is Christ-like? What is Christ-centered? And that sometimes while moral wisdom may tell us how to live life successfully in one area, there are things that the world around us would look at and say, well, here's a mark of success. If you do these things, you will be successful. And sometimes, as followers of Christ, we say, yeah, but there's something else that matters even more. Because Christ chose to live a life that was sacrificial, that sometimes even went against his own personal best interests out of love for others. And as followers of Christ, we make choices that the world around may look at and say, that seems foolish. And yet we look at it through the perspective of Christ and say, no, this is wise. We're all engaged in making those judgments constantly. Sometimes as we walk out our faith, we see things in others that are distressing to us or upsetting. I remember many years ago, Burnett and I were living in Southern California, and we were attending a very large church down there. And there would be a couple thousand people on a Sunday morning that showed up for church. And one Sunday they had baby dedications. Now, when they had baby dedications, they had baby dedications, the whole line of people and babies up front. And I'm watching as all the people are streaming up to the front for this baby dedication. And one couple catches my eye. And you could just tell, what was going on just watching them walk to the front. This woman, she had a rather domineering demeanor about her, very large, striding out, really leading them down the aisle. She's got the baby in one arm, she's got her husband on the other, and he looks like, I hate to say it, but kind of a little mouse of a man. He has his hand just kind of tucked underneath her arm. He's got his head down, he's not really looking up where they're going. And she leads him to the front, and they stand there, and she holds the baby, and the minister came by, and she handed the baby to the minister, and the minister prayed, and he handed the baby back. And meanwhile, this little guy just stands there the whole time, just looking down, not even making eye contact with the minister. And I can remember inside of me, this just irritated me. You can just see the dynamic to this relationship, and I thought, this is not right. I even thought about this child, the home they're growing up in, and it bothered me. But then again, if I'm right that we're to judge the path and not the person, I'd have to say that what had me upset that morning wasn't necessarily the path that either of these parents was on, but it was the kind of people it appeared that they were. And yet Jesus said, Matthew 7, verse 1, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Bad judging. What is it? And what makes it so bad? Let me give you 3 key words that I want to unpack this morning. The first is the word disassociate. The second, despise. And the third, discipline. Let's talk about disassociate, to not associate with someone. In Jesus' day, what did judging look like? I think it's easy for us to read Christ's words through a modern lens of hypersensitive, politically correct, trigger word avoiding, university-approved safe spaces that wants to make sure that no one is offended over anything. And yet, the day that Jesus lived in, there wasn't much time given to political correctness. People had their prejudices and they were just kind of right out there in your face. You want to see an example of this? Take a look at Jesus when he meets the woman at the well. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." She says, "I know how this works. It's pretty obvious. Nobody's making any apologies here. Nobody's all offended about your insensitivity. I just know that you Jews don't deal with us Samaritans. Why are you asking me for a drink?" Or Jesus meets a man named Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector, apparently a short guy. He climbed up in a tree so he'd get a look at Jesus through the crowd. And Jesus comes to where this guy is up in the tree, and he says to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." And when they saw it, they all grumbled. The people standing around grumbling because he's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. They had this guy sized up, hung out. They knew who he was. He's a sinner. Why would you have lunch with him? Or the Apostle Peter. Later on, he's asked to go and talk to a man named Cornelius and the people in his household, people who are Gentiles. Look what Peter has to say when he gets to Cornelius' house. Peter said, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean." If you read this broader story, you'll find that before the people from Cornelius came and asked Peter to come and talk to them, it literally took a vision from heaven to convince Peter that it was the right thing to do to associate with these Gentiles. That kind of racism sounds pretty shocking in our day, doesn't it? That people would be that overt, that upfront with their disdain for someone else, that they would have nothing to do with them simply because of their race or the way that they think. And And it's tempting to think that that kind of harsh judgment is just a relic of maybe a less sophisticated and a more socially stratified era that we have moved beyond. We have grown past that kind of thing. And I think in many ways we have. It's wonderful that there is a lot more sensitivity to other people, that there's a lot more deference made in the words that we use and the ways that we treat other people. And yet, I'm not convinced that we have necessarily really moved the needle all that far in the human heart. Not just within the church, but within our society, within people. There is still plenty of judgment and prejudice to go around. Maybe you know the name Brendan Eich, the author of JavaScript, co-founder of Mozilla, the maker of Firefox, a web browser. In 2014, he was forced to step down as the CEO of the company that he had co-founded. Not because he had done anything criminal, not because he had abused finances, not because he was mismanaging the company, but because a group of people found out that back in 2008, he had donated $1,000 to a political action committee that was supporting what was, I believe, Proposition 8 in California, which was to not allow gay marriage. A proposition which passed at the time. Brendan was actually on the side of the majority in that particular election in supporting that initiative. It was later thrown out by a court, but he was not in the minority in his thinking or his action. But in 2014, some people found out that he had thought wrong, at least in their minds he had, and they started a boycott of his company to demand that he be ousted because in their thinking, anyone who could think a thought like that wasn't worthy to be allowed to have a place of leadership. I think that wrongful judging is largely a matter of disassociation more than disapproval. In some cases, like with the ancient Jews versus Gentiles, or with maybe our modern warriors of political correctness, it can take very overt forms, but it can also subtly creep in all sorts of ways. We may not verbalize it, but inside we draw the lines and we quietly move away from people we disapprove of. Here's Jesus' words when he talked about how we should deal with the world at large. Matthew 7. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged. And with the measure you use it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Now, Luke actually picks up and relates this message again. Luke 6. Judge not, you'll not be judged. Condemn not, you'll not be condemned. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? But Luke actually records even more of what Jesus said than Matthew does. And to see the big context, you need to jump all the way back to verse 27 of Luke chapter 6. And if we're going to really think about what Jesus taught and understand it, I think we need more than just a soundbite. So read with me, if you will, this longer passage that I think puts this teaching in context. Luke 6, verse 27. I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies, and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. He also told them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, Brother, let me take the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye. Let me try and sum it up for you. What Jesus says is, as his followers, there's going to be a great reversal in how we do life. He says enemies should get loved. Bullies are given a second free punch. Pesky beggars get gifts. Lenders go looking for people that can't repay so they can lend to them. And people who have just cause to disassociate from the mean and the irresponsible are asked to withhold judgment. Here's the key phrase. It goes back to verse 35 and 36. Speaking of God, he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Isn't that good news? Isn't that good news that our Father is merciful, that he is kind to ungrateful people? I don't know about you, but sometimes I can be that child. Stomping my foot because I didn't get what I wanted. I didn't get it the way I wanted it. Sometimes my actions, either overtly or subtly, if I'm honest, have been motivated by evil. And yet my Heavenly Father is kind, and he's merciful. I want to remind you that this is your Heavenly Father's heart toward you. You may have had a parent who was angry, vindictive, abusive, neglectful, but your truest father is motivated by love. What does that say? What are the implications for my own behavior? Well, first it says that I should adopt a posture of mercy. I give what I would like to receive, not what they deserve. I give without regard to reciprocation. What do I get back out of the deal? I withhold condemnation. I extend forgiveness. I begin with overcoming my own blindness before I focus on my brother's shortcomings. What's the problem with judging? Let me suggest 4 things. There are probably more, but 4 that come to me when I think about judging and the problem with it. The first is that judges must view themselves as superior to those they judge. I have to believe that I'm better than you if I'm going to stand in judgment over you. But that means I can't look too closely at my own shortcomings, right? I mean, if I really put my own laundry list up, maybe I wouldn't feel quite so superior. As Jesus says, it requires ignoring the blinding plank in my own eye while I obsess over the microsurgery of the speck that is in yours. A second thing is that judges are primarily interested in what they deem as fair and enforcing that obligations are met and penalties are paid. And mercy is not job 1 for a judge. Have you ever gotten busted by one of those traffic cameras? The unyielding, unblinking, unforgiving eye of the traffic camera. Once they get you, if you've never had this experience, you're had. I have received one of these in the mail, and there is a picture, a close-up of my face driving the car. There's a picture of my license plate to prove that it was indeed my car. There's a picture of my car in the intersection with the light the wrong color above my car. There's no doubt about the fact that I'm guilty. How would it feel to have a traffic camera mounted on your car 24/7 just following you around? Everything you do, it takes a picture and sends you the notice. Some of us go through life like this. We're the traffic cameras. We're constantly watching other people, and we let them know, every time the light's the wrong color. Judges often, the third thing I would say is that judges often have to determine intent, not just outward action, but the motive behind the action. That's a lot of what we do when we judge wrongly, isn't it? I know why you did that. I see right through you. I know exactly why you did that. The problem is we usually don't. We're pretty limited on what we know about each other. It's only God that truly knows the heart. Here's a fourth problem I see with judging, and it's an issue of identity. Last week, I mentioned sociologist Charles Horton Cooley. Remember this guy? He was the one that penned this idea of the looking glass self. The idea of the looking glass self is that my image of myself is influenced by how I perceive others perceive me. That make sense? What I think you think about me affects how I think about myself. Do you realize that when we judge others, when we judge their intents, even though we don't really know them, we are creating the labels, the definitions, the impressions, the perceptions that actually cause them to define themselves. When we judge wrongly, we are actually distorting their image. And that's not our right. It's not our role. Who they are is who they are before God, because God alone knows their heart. God knows who they are. He knows who He's created them to be. If that person is outside of Christ, you know how God sees them? God sees them as lost children who are worthy of great sacrifice to bring them home. If they're in Christ, He sees them as carrying the very identity of His beloved Son. That is who they are. If they're rebels and they're pushing God away, Jesus tells that story, the prodigal son and the father who eagerly waits on the front porch to welcome that prodigal home, to bless them and to receive them and love them again. How dare we distort that image when God alone, who is merciful, is the final judge? Jesus reminds us that God, the one who is truly superior, the one who truly knows the heart's intent, the one who sees all and the one against whom all wrong ultimately is committed, is nevertheless compulsively merciful. Nothing aligns us better with the heart and the blessing of God than when we show mercy. That's in keeping with who He is. Nothing puts us at odds with God's heart more than when we sit in judgment on others and we fail to show His mercy. Judge not, and you will not be judged. But here's a question that comes up for me. Judge by whom? Judge not, you'll not be judged. Who's judging? I'll tell you how I used to think of this. I used to think that it was the idea of if you give others a break, they'll be more apt to give you a break. And yet I've discovered that the world doesn't usually work that way. I've given people breaks and I didn't get anything in return. And there have been people who've given me breaks and I don't think I really did justice to the break they gave me the other way. And I don't think that's what this verse is talking about. In fact, if you look at the bigger context, look at verses 37 through 38. Judge not, you'll not be judged. Condemn not, you'll not be condemned. Forgive, you'll be forgiven. And it will be given to you. And now look how it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. That blessing. Who is doing the blessing in this sense? Is it the person who's been blessed? Well, I don't think so, because He's already said that what He wants us to do is find people who can't repay and give to them. So if this person's already dead broke and they can't pay me back, I don't think they're in the position to be blessing me abundantly, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. So who's the blesser? Well, the blesser is God. God is the one who blesses. Who is the one who judges? God is the one who judges. The only one that I'm up against when I enter into judging of others is I stand before God and before his opinion of what I'm doing. Proverbs 3:34. Toward the scorners he is scornful, but to the humble he gives favor. Romans 12:16. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Judging others, determining that they are unworthy of respect, disassociating ourselves is simply an act of pride. That's not to say that we shouldn't identify sin as sin or draw boundaries. Remember, when it comes to choosing the right path, we are constantly thinking and asking questions and making choices and judging what is right and true. And there may be path choices people make, people we love make, that we have to say no to. Not rejecting the person, but declining to follow their path. Now, sometimes that is offensive to people. It's not to say we've been wrong to say the way you're going is wrong and I can't go there, but it feels that way. One of the real blessings, I think, to marriages, I know in our marriage, is the invention of the GPS. Because you see, I really don't like being told that I'm going the wrong direction when I'm driving. And before GPS, occasionally my wife, in love, would say to me, sweetheart, I think we're going the wrong way. The really bad thing was sometimes deep down inside, I was pretty sure she was right. But I didn't want to admit it. You know, I figure if I make a few more left turns, I'll get around to where she wants to go anyway, but it will look like I meant to do this the whole time, right? We don't like anyone telling us that the way we're going isn't the right way. We'd all like to be right. GPS has saved a lot of marriage counseling bills. You can see an example of this in John the Baptist. John the Baptist, if you remember the story, he gets arrested by Herod, but Herod also wants to hear from John. And so he keeps calling John in to talk to him. And one of the things that John says as he's talking to Herod is, he says, you know what you've done in divorcing your wife and then marrying your brother's wife, that was wrong. Now, that's pretty gutsy to say that to a guy like Herod, because Herod wasn't known for being a cream puff. He had a lot of people killed. But John says, what you've done, the path you're on, is a wrong path. Now, interestingly, while Herod kept John in prison, he also kept him alive. In fact, part of the reason he kept him in prison was to protect him, because while Herod could handle what John had said, and he actually wanted to keep talking to him, they keep interacting. It says good things about their relationship that Herod wanted to hear from John. Herod's wife was really mad. She did not like the fact that this guy had the nerve to say, you're doing the wrong thing. And she wanted him dead. And so we find out that Herod actually kept John in prison, really under protective arrest, because he knew that his wife Herodias wanted the guy dead. Herodias eventually worked it out to where she was able to get John executed. And Herod himself appears to have been sad and frustrated when that happened. Somehow Herod knew that John cared about him, even though he didn't agree with where he was going. Second word, despise. And in this case, I want to talk about judging within the church. And I want to read another slightly longer passage to you. It comes out of Romans chapter 14, the first 10 verses. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. I'm so glad that he indicates that the meat eaters are not the weak ones. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. The key word there is despise. It gives us a little glimpse of a little full understanding of what this idea of judgment means when it's used in a negative sense. If you've been around the church at large, for long, you'll know that Christians can, in the name of truth, sometimes be very partisan. Denominational lines can be rigid. Doctrinal distinctives can become dividing lines and points of conflict and sometimes outright war. Paul doesn't poo-poo the fact that there are differences of opinion. In fact, he applauds those who choose to participate or to abstain in various things because they do those out of a sense of trying to work out their faith, to express, both by what they choose to do and what they choose not to do, their commitment to following Jesus Christ. But what he warns about is judging one another over those distinctives, as sincerely held as they may be. And again, I think the key word there is despise. The King James, I like the phrase it uses. It's got this old English phrase. Instead of the word despise, it says set at naught. How's that for a great phrase? Set at naught. What does that mean? Well, naught is the same as ought. O-U-G-H-T, just drop the N. And we are calling the 2000s, as far as years, we're calling it the decade of the aughts, the zeros. My dad was born actually before the turn of the last century. He was born 1897. And I remember as a kid hearing Dad talk about, aught 6 and aught 7. It's zero. Now that's different than the word ought, A-U-G-H-T, which is you ought to do this or that. You should do this or that. This version of ought means nothing. It means zero. In other words, to set at naught someone means to declare them a zero. It's not just that I've used my best judgment to choose the life practices that I think are most honoring to my Savior. No, I take a step further. And I view my brother or my sister who practices differently than I do with disdain, with contempt. I see them as a big zero. I belittle them. I regard their faith as inferior to my own, as them being less pleasing to God. Paul reminds us that the only one any of us has to give account to is God himself. And so on debatable matters, we are best to leave those things humbly in his hands. Did I mention that God is merciful? Discipline. What about church discipline? Because if we're going to talk about judgment, nothing would make you feel more judged than to somehow fall under an act of church discipline. What do we do with that? I'm going to share a passage with you that is going to look like it contradicts everything I've just discussed. So let's do it. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you need to go out of the world. But now I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. Whoa, what happened to being merciful? Well, a few things to keep in mind. First is that Paul is being clear here. He's only talking about those who are within the fellowship of professing believers. He says this doesn't apply to people outside of the family of Christ, because if it did, there'd be nobody to associate with, because we're surrounded by people that are involved in lifestyles like this. In fact, that's the point of the gospel. The point of the gospel is the good news that things that can bring us into bondage and that can destroy us and destroy those around us, Christ has come to set us free from those things. And we should share that news with those we love so that they can have that kind of freedom. Certainly he's not saying we shouldn't associate with them. What he's doing is he's warning about people who profess a life path that is committed to following Jesus, and yet who display a life path that is consumed with everything that goes against Jesus. We're not talking here about people that struggle with an area of sin. All right? We all struggle in various ways. He's talking about people who have openly adopted and embraced and live out a lifestyle that is contrary to the way of Christ. Sexual immorality. People who use and abuse others for their own sexual satisfaction. Greed. People who pursue wealth and possessions with lust and selfish ambition. Swindlers. Those who demonstrate a pattern of proven dishonesty and manipulation of others to get ahead. Idolaters. Those who actively worship false religious systems that fly in the face of devotion to Christ. Revilers. Crass, profane, verbal bullies that hold others in contempt. Drunkards. Those who live a life shamelessly consumed with excess and addiction and self-gratification. Why? Why within the church should we come to a place where we may have to abstain from a relationship? Well, first, people that are committed to those paths are apt to draw others into the same. People who have tried to free themselves from old patterns of life will be drawn back into them, oftentimes by those associations, to their own harm. Christ has called us into a community that should live in spiritual freedom. But if someone comes into that community and is trying to encourage others to go back to lifestyles that once enslaved them, Paul says at some point you need to separate, because it flies in the face of what this community is supposed to be about. It also destroys the witness of Christ. We talked about the reasons that people don't go to church. And one of the biggies is they've seen hypocrisy. They've seen people that go to church a lot and appear to be members in good standing, but they've experienced their lives outside of the walls of the church, and it hasn't looked very Christ-like. Church discipline is never an easy thing to engage in. I don't think it should ever be undertaken lightly. It is the course of last resort. And I think that where discipline happens, it should be rescinded as soon as there is evidence of true repentance. In fact, it's interesting, Paul himself, in the book of 1 Corinthians, he tells the church that they needed to exercise some discipline. There was actually a guy in their church who was living common law with his mother-in-law. And they were kind of letting it go because they thought it was a sign that they were really gracious, that they weren't making any bones about this. And Paul says, that's not good. There's all kinds of things wrong with that. You need to exercise some discipline. In this case, he says you need to put the guy out. Well, they apparently did that. Apparently did a really good job of it. The guy apparently repented, and they wouldn't let him back in. So in 2 Corinthians, he writes them again, and he says this. I take it from the Message. Now, regarding the one who started all this turmoil, the person in question who caused all this pain, I want you to know that I am not the one injured in this as much as, with a few exceptions, all of you. So I don't want to come down too hard. What the majority of you agreed to as punishment is punishment enough. Now is the time to forgive this man and help him back on his feet. If all you do is pour on the guilt, you could very well drown him in it. My counsel now is to pour on the love. You know, the thing that worries me more than the possibility of church discipline is the probability of my own proud tendency to judge others and fail to live in mercy. You remember the couple I told you about at the beginning and the baby dedication? The Bossy Lady, the little mouse of a man. When the dedication was over and people were going back to their seats, I couldn't take my eyes off these two. I kind of kept watching them. They went back up the aisle, much as they had come down, him following meekly along behind her, head down. And they got back to the pew, and when they got to the pew where they were going to sit down, I saw her take his hand out from under her arm, and she set it on the back of the pew so he could feel his way back to his seat. Because you see, it wasn't that he was timid, he was blind. And it wasn't that she was being bossy in leading him down the aisle, she was loving him. And it wasn't that she'd found a man that she could use, it was she'd found a man that she'd given herself to love him and stand by him. And he wasn't a coward. He was willing to step up and be a father even though he had to deal with a handicap. And I was no great judge of humanity. I was just a fool that didn't know really the story of these people's lives. Luke chapter 6. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Amen.